This is July 10th, Red Queen Consulting Wednesday Performance Talks, Mental Models. So in the previous two sessions, what we talked about was kind of an overview of team performance and what performance coaching is. As a reminder, in team performance, we talk about primarily what's on the right, which are the 7 drivers of team effectiveness: capability, cooperation, coordination, communication, cognitions, conditions, and coaching. The previous sessions have more of a deep dive into that, as well as how we coach to that a little bit and what we focus on through performance coaching and how we address each of those different drivers and what's really critical to watch. And tonight we're going to talk a little bit about mental models and why mental models are important. And this is this used to be a very highly focused part of research in industrial organizational psychology, and I'm talking about the late 80s and the mid 90s. Since then, the mental model concept has kind of become just part of the body of research, and they've moved on to other topical areas. But I still find the concept is one of the underpinning, important, now kind of latent things that underpins everything and specific areas of the effectiveness drivers. And it's important to understand mental models have been shown through significant research over time to be critically important for determining how well individuals can perform and teams can perform at task accomplishment. And specifically, the better the team has a shared mental model around how the work gets done and what's expected in performing the work, the better the output of the work will be, and the better the team will be at delivering the tasks necessary to complete the work. So that's a very broad generalization. We're not talking about, complex work versus complicated work, but just generally in the research. That's what we know. And those mental models underpin a lot of what we talk about in the effectiveness drivers. So specifically, I've highlighted the areas that are supported by mental models. So a mental model is we constantly generate and create these internal states for how we view the world in our minds, right? In the OODA loop, John Boyd's OODA loop, this is kind of the orientation part. When we talk about OODA, it's observe, orient, decide, act. And in that orientation phase, we are leveraging our pre-existing models, our pre-experienced and our patterns for how we think about things, our heuristics, our biases. All of those things are mental models. So when you get up in the morning and you're going to go to the store, you have a mental model for how that should occur, right? I should take a car, I should obey traffic laws and patterns based on the country and the laws and the rules in which I live, and then I should go to the store. There are social customs. So these are all mental models for how we think things go. We think about elections, we think about communal interactions, we think about religious practice and ceremony. All of those things we have built mental models over time for. And they're flawed. They can be flawed in significant ways. That can significantly impact your team's performance. When your team doesn't have a correct or shared mental model, but they have to work together interdependently, it will impact their ability to perform tasks. And that's why it's so important to talk about it. So in coordination, specifically monitoring, the ability to monitor and adapt to changing circumstances relies on the team's ability to, number one, have a shared mental model, and number two, update their mental model as things change, whether that's internally within the team or externally, customers, consumers, markets, et cetera. And that affects their ability to provide support. Providing support is like backup activities. And if you can't complete something, my ability to step in and complete it for you. If we don't have a shared mental model for how we work together, that's very hard. Communication obviously is also, in terms of quality versus quantity and clear, accurate, and timely. If we don't have the shared mental model to understand, like, well, what is quality versus quantity? What would clear communication be? How do I know if it's going to be timely and accurate communication? That depends on our mental model for how we work and what's important and what priority our work takes and the tasks that we're going to do. In cognition, which is kind of really the big one, and this is where a lot of the mental models fall into, obviously vision, goals, and purpose, right? What are we trying to do and why are we here? And why is this important and why does it matter? These are the big picture items. This is where leadership is really important. And the job of leadership, everyone talk about, leadership's number one job is to communicate, right? Communicate. because you are building mental models in your team for what's important and what matters. That's your job as a leader, to communicate that and to get their feedback when they're not clear on why or how or what's important or what isn't, what we call constraints or guidelines and guardrails. Same with priorities. Obviously, priorities are also dependent upon how do we prioritize, what constitutes a priority. That's a mental model. What are the more important versus the less important things? Is that based on risk? Is it based on revenue, return, speed, time, quality? Like, how do we prioritize? What are our criteria? What is our schema? Those, if you want to get good at prioritizing, you have to have a really good shared mental model for what constitutes a priority. Roles are usually codified, and that's where also task norms, interdependencies, rationale, like some of that, and some of the conditions we'll also see. Roles are also like, what's my role? What's my job here? Well, that's an indicator you don't have a good mental model for what you're expected to do. How are you going to be successful at performing tasks if you're not clear, right? Task norms and interdependencies, we just did talk about that. Rationale, contingency plans. So especially when we're doing manufacturing or operational environments, well, how are we planning for contingencies and what if scenarios, and building out resilience plans for when failures occur? We need those shared mental models to be very coherent and very well understood so that we can execute quickly. If you think about the way you operate on, for example, an oil rig, there's not a lot of time, if something goes wrong, for everyone to react to the situation and do what's necessary to maintain a safe operating environment. So those contingency plans represent shared mental models for what's supposed to happen, what needs to happen, who has decision authority, who will make decisions, how they'll be communicated, what do we do if a system goes down or we need a redundant system, or if the redundant system goes down, what happens. Those are shared mental models, and our ability to fall back on those mental models and to adapt them is critical in performance. And obviously, situational awareness. The critical thing for a mental model, a good question would be, well, how do you have a mental model for situational awareness? Because you're trying to update what the situation is and maintain awareness of what's going on, which is true. The mental model goes back to priorities. What is important to pay attention to? Because we can take in a lot of information. I have to sort and filter the information. For me to maintain effective situational awareness, I need to know and have a mental model for what is the important information. What do I need to pay attention to? What needs to be updated? What is noise? So signal to noise ratio, what's the noise? I need to focus on the signal that matters to us in our operating environment or in our context. So cognition is a big one. It's probably the biggest one in the 7 drivers of team effectiveness. In the conditions, these are the things external to the team, right? So these are things the team can't control. But examples of mental models are like, what are company rules and policies? What are our guidelines, right? People always wonder, well, how could they not follow the policy? Well, did they know about it? Did everyone have the same understanding of how the policy is written? And everybody who's worked in a legal environment, who's not a lawyer, knows sometimes interpreting legalese can be very challenging and you don't really know. But that means your mental model is imperfect and it's going to be harder to execute against it. Culture is a mental model. How do we act together? How do we treat one another? How do we relate? How do we communicate? How do we share information? What's appropriate? What is not appropriate? Like, those are our mental models. We build those socially as well as in a business sense. And that's just a normal part of being a human. And we kind of talked about decision-making authority as a part of prioritization as well. So the critical point to take away for mental models is these underpin all the parts of our working environments and our day-to-day lives, really, and our day-to-day activities and everything that we do. If you're a leader or an executive, if you're a team lead, if you're working with other people, realizing and understanding when do we have a disconnect in our mental models for how things are supposed to happen, what's supposed to happen, when it's supposed to happen, why that's important, and how do we codify that, that affects our team's ability to perform and thus our organization's ability to perform. And that happens interpersonally, it happens within teams, across departments, across organizations, across societies, right? We can not even going to talk about the political implications, but it's a good reflection of having countercultures and subcultures, even within a society that's considered to be the same society, they have very different mental models for what is appropriate, what should be appropriate, what should happen. And that when you can't resolve that, it creates conflict. Conflict obviously is detrimental to effective work performance. So you've got to work very hard to make sure those mental models are correct, updated, shared, and understood by everybody on your team. So that's all the prepared material I have for mental models at this point, and we'll turn over this time to questions.